There's a moment you've probably felt before you understood it. You're standing near a window, or maybe outside with a cup of something warm, and you notice that the yard is quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of early morning before the birds wake up. Something else. A different kind of stillness. The feeder is full. The trees are right where they've always been. Nothing has moved, and yet something feels off. Most people dismiss it. They go back inside. They assume nothing happened. But something did happen. Something you didn't see. Because what you were actually witnessing wasn't an absence. It was a signal. And it was already communicating by the time you arrived. Let's start with something simple. A bird lands on a feeder. It takes a seed, flies to a branch, eats, returns, takes another. This is the pattern you know. Reliable, rhythmic, almost mechanical. On a good morning, there might be 4 or 5 species cycling through. Chickadees, finches, nuthatches. Each one with its own timing, its own perch preference, its own level of wariness. It looks casual. It is not. Every one of those visits is calculated. Not consciously, not with deliberation, but through something older than deliberation. A continuous real-time assessment of risk and reward. Every time a bird lands at your feeder, it is simultaneously eating and listening. It is watching the angles. It is tracking the edges of your yard the way you might scan a crowd. And it knows within a few seconds whether the environment feels safe enough to stay. When it does, the visits string together into something you start to recognize as normal. And then one morning, they stop. The feeder's full, the weather's the same, you didn't change anything. But the birds aren't coming, or they're coming in short, abrupt bursts, land, grab, gone, no lingering, no cycling back. A chickadee lands for half a second, doesn't even take a seed, and leaves. You watch it and think, that's strange. What you're seeing is the surface of something deeper. Somewhere in your yard, maybe in the oak at the back corner, maybe in the dense shrubs along the fence. Something changed. An animal is there, or recently was. A hawk perched long enough to leave a trace of its presence. A cat moved through the underbrush an hour ago. A Cooper's hawk made a pass over the property and banked away, unseen by you, but not by anything else in that yard. The birds knew before you did, and the way they communicated that knowledge was not through sound, it was through silence. This is worth pausing on. We tend to think of wildlife communication as something active, birdsong, alarm calls, movement, and those are real. But some of the most important information in a natural environment travels through absence, through the sudden suspension of normal behavior, through a stillness that, if you know how to read it, is louder than any alarm. Ornithologists have a name for the effect. They call it the landscape of fear. It describes the way prey animals, and birds, very much behave as prey in their own ecosystems. Don't just respond to predators when they appear. They carry a mental map of where predators tend to be, when they tend to move, what signals their proximity. And they adjust their behavior constantly, invisibly, in response to that map. Your feeder exists within that map. When the landscape of fear shifts, when the map changes, you feel it as quiet. Think about what has to happen for a bird to visit your feeder consistently. It isn't just hunger driving that decision. A house finch, for example, can identify dozens of feeding sites within its territory. It chooses between them based on food quality, competition from other birds, distance to cover, and, critically, perceived safety. A feeder in the open, with no nearby shrubs or branches to escape to, will be used less than one positioned with good cover access. Not because the bird made a logical calculation, but because its nervous system has been shaped over millions of years to weight those variables automatically. The bird is not thinking about the hawk, but it is behaving as if it always is. So when you see consistent visits to your feeder, daily, reliable, patterned, what you are actually seeing is an animal that has determined repeatedly that your yard is safe enough. That decision is not guaranteed. It is renewed every morning. and it can be withdrawn in an instant. There's a study from the University of Wisconsin, done with songbirds in suburban green spaces, that tracked feeding behavior against predator activity over several months. What they found wasn't surprising exactly, but it was striking. When hawk activity increased in an area, bird visits to feeders dropped not just during the hawk's presence, but for hours afterward, sometimes an entire day. The birds weren't just responding to danger they could see. They were treating the environment itself as contaminated, as a place where the risk calculus had changed, even if the threat was gone. This isn't paranoia, it's precision. The bird that flies away from a feeder 30 minutes after a hawk left is not being irrational. It's being accurate, because hawks return to productive hunting grounds. Because risk in a natural system isn't just about what's happening now. It's about what the current moment predicts about the next one. The silence in your yard is that prediction made audible. But let's go a layer deeper, because it's not just birds, and it's not just predators. The quiet that settles over a yard before something goes wrong is a collective phenomenon. It involves multiple species, different sensory systems, overlapping networks of attention. What one animal detects, others can read. Not through communication exactly, not through a signal sent intentionally from one to another, but through behavior that, when it changes, ripples outward. A squirrel freezes on a branch, not because it saw anything, because a bird above it stopped calling. A robin stops foraging in the grass, not because it heard a hawk, because it noticed the absence of the small insects that scatter when something large is moving nearby. A group of house sparrows, which had been squabbling at the feeder, suddenly goes quiet and drops into the dense shrubs below it. Not because any one of them detected a threat, because the energy of the yard shifted and each one independently read that shift and responded. This is what ecologists sometimes call passive information transfer. Information moving not as a signal but as a pattern. Not danger is coming, but something changed, and change is something to take seriously. By the time you notice the yard is quiet, that information has already traveled through several species, several sensory systems, several behaviors. You are not the first to know. You are the last. Stand in your yard and try to notice what you usually ignore. Not the birds at the feeder. You already watched those. The birds at the edge. The ones in the periphery of the property, in the trees along the boundary, in the neighbor's hedge. These are the birds that aren't feeding. They're watching. And the pattern of their watching, how still they hold themselves, how often they move, in which direction they're oriented, is a continuous broadcast of information about the state of your yard. When those birds are relaxed, when they're moving freely and foraging loosely, everything else in the yard tends to be active too. The system is in a resting state. Risk is low. When those birds go still, when they hold their position and orient in one direction, something has entered their awareness. Not necessarily a predator. Could be a cat 4 houses over that just crossed into a line of sight. Could be the shadow of a large bird passing overhead. Could be a change in wind direction that carried something new. You won't see what they saw, but you'll feel the yard change. That feeling is information. Most people just don't know how to label it. There's something worth understanding about the way your own nervous system processes these environments. Humans evolved in landscapes that worked exactly like this. Open savannas, forest edges, mixed habitats. Places where the behavior of animals around you was not decoration. It was data. Your ancestors read the stillness of a herd. They listened for the silence before predators moved. They understood at a body level that when the birds stopped singing, the world had just become more dangerous. That capacity didn't disappear. It just became unexercised. When you feel something is off in your yard before you can see what it is, you're not imagining things. You're running a very old perceptual program, one that was built for exactly this kind of environment reading. The unease you feel is your nervous system detecting a pattern disruption and flagging it, even though your conscious mind hasn't finished processing what changed. The birds are faster. but you're reading from the same signal. Now consider what this means for the moment, right before something actually happens. A hawk is perched in your oak tree, still, backlit by early morning light. You haven't seen it, but the yard knows. The feeder is empty of birds. The squirrel that usually crosses the fence at this hour hasn't appeared. The robins that forage in the back corner, gone. The air feels different in a way you might describe as heavy, or still, or waiting. These are not metaphors. The weight you feel is real. It's the absence of sound pressure, of the ambient rustling, calling, foraging movement that normally fills a yard. That presence of ambient sound is something your auditory system has already cataloged as normal. When it drops below the threshold you've unconsciously established, your brain notes it, often before you consciously register what you're noticing. And then the hawk moves. It drops from the branch, crosses the yard in a low, fast arc. And whether it takes something or doesn't, whether the yard witnessed a successful hunt or a failed attempt, what happens next is almost always the same. Nothing. For several minutes, sometimes longer, the yard stays still. Even after the hawk is gone, even after the threat has passed, the system holds its breath, recalibrates, gradually comes back online. First one bird calls from a distant tree, then another. Then the sparrows return to the feeder, cautiously, in ones and twos. The squirrel reappears. The robins come back to the grass, and the yard sounds like a yard again. You probably have a baseline. You just haven't named it. After enough mornings at a window or on a porch, you carry an internal model of how your yard is supposed to sound and feel. How active it is by 8 a.m., which birds come first, how long it takes for the feeder to get busy, when the squirrels usually show up. You built this model slowly, without meaning to, through repetition, and when the yard deviates from it, when it's quieter than it should be, when the usual visitors don't appear, when the ambient activity feels lower than normal, you notice, even if you can't articulate what you noticed. That's the thing about ecological systems. They produce patterns so consistent that their disruption becomes perceptible even to observers who don't know they're observing. You don't have to be a naturalist to feel it. You just have to have spent enough time near that particular patch of the world, which means the quiet isn't random, and your response to it isn't irrational. It's a signal, received by the yard, interpreted by the animals that live in it, and finally felt by you, the last note in a network of attention that had been running long before you stepped outside. Think about the last time your yard went quiet, or any outdoor space you spend time in. A park bench where the pigeons suddenly scattered, a trail where the songbirds stopped mid-morning, a backyard that felt, for a stretch, oddly still. You may have looked around and seen nothing. You may have gone back to what you were doing, but something did happen. Something was there, or recently was. Something changed in the ledger of risk that every animal in that environment carries constantly, and the system responded, not dramatically, not obviously, but accurately, in the only language it has. Silence is not empty. In a living system, silence is a message. It means something is different here. Something altered the math. Wait. The birds know this. The squirrels know this. And somewhere underneath all the noise of modern life, you know this too. You've always known it. You just forgot, for a while, that you were part of the same system. Next time you step outside and feel the quiet, not peaceful quiet, but that quiet, don't dismiss it. Stand still for a moment. Look at the edges first. The fence line, the tree canopy, the shadowed areas. Listen not for what's there, but for what isn't. Notice which birds are absent. Notice where the squirrels aren't. Let your nervous system do what it was designed to do in the environment it was designed to read. You won't always find what caused it. Most of the time, the hawk has already gone. The cat is already 3 yards over. The moment has passed, but the habit of noticing, of treating quiet as information rather than absence, changes how you inhabit these spaces. You stop being a passive observer of nature and start being something that nature is in its own way, aware of. Because here's the thing they don't tell you. When you stand still in a quiet yard, reading the edges the way the birds do, you are not just observing the system. You are in it. And eventually, if you stay long enough and move slowly enough, the birds come back to the feeder while you're still standing there. The squirrel crosses the yard without detour. The robins return to the grass 3 feet from where you're standing. Not because they forgot you, because they recalculated and decided you were safe. That's not nothing. That's the yard deciding it can trust you. And that trust, quiet, unannounced, unremarkable, is how wild systems let you in.